January 17, 1945. Aachen, Germany. 3:47 a.m. The cellar smelled of damp stone and fear. Frau Elisabeth Mahler pressed her daughter closer against the cold wall, feeling the child's heartbeat through layers of worn wool. Above them, the thunder had stopped. Not the thunder of storms, but the kind that came from the sky in waves, shaking centuries-old buildings until their bones turned to dust. For 6 days, the sound of American artillery had been constant, a mechanical heartbeat that never slept, never tired, never showed mercy. Now, silence. In that silence, something worse arrived: footsteps. Heavy boots on cobblestone. The scrape of rifle stocks against doorframes. Voices calling out in a language Elizabeth didn't understand, but whose meaning was carved into her memory by 4 years of Goebbels broadcasts, by whispered stories from the Eastern Front, by everything the Reich had told her about what happened to German women when the enemies came. She had heard about the Red Army in East Prussia. Everyone had. The refugees streaming westward carried stories that made mothers hold their daughters tighter and old men who had survived the Great War weep openly. And if the Bolsheviks were monsters, what would the Americans be? They were allied with the Russians. They bombed cities full of women and children. They had no honor, no culture, no soul, just machines and cruelty wrapped in democratic lies. The cellar door opened. Light from a torch cut through the darkness. Elizabeth closed her eyes and began to pray. This moment, repeated in 1,000 cellars across the Rhineland in early 1945, represented a collision not just of armies, but of realities. For 12 years, the German people had been fed a steady diet of racial ideology and enemy propaganda. The Americans were depicted as a mongrel nation, corrupted by Jewish influence and Negro culture, mechanized but spiritually hollow. They would rape, pillage, and destroy. This was the promise of total war coming home. But something unexpected happened in those cellars, in those ruined streets, in the aid stations and field hospitals that followed the American advance into the Reich. Something that didn't fit the narrative carved into the German consciousness. The soldiers who came down those cellar stairs, who found the terrified women and children and elderly men hiding in the darkness, did not behave as the propaganda ministry had promised. They offered chocolate. They offered medical care. They offered warm blankets. This discrepancy, between expectation and reality, between propaganda and practice, created a psychological rupture whose implications would echo far beyond the immediate moment of surrender. For the German women who begged for mercy and received instead a meal ration and a medic, the experience challenged not just their understanding of the enemy, but their understanding of everything the Reich had told them about the world. To understand what those women expected, you must first understand what they had been promised. Since 1933, the Nazi state had constructed an elaborate mythology about race, nation, and the nature of warfare. This wasn't merely propaganda. It was a complete reimagining of reality, a totalizing worldview that touched every aspect of German life. At its core was the concept of racial hierarchy. The Germans, specifically the Aryan Germans, sat at the apex of human civilization. Below them cascaded various grades of lesser peoples, from the Slavs to the Africans, with Jews occupying a special category of existential threat. The Americans, in this taxonomy, were particularly contemptible precisely because they claimed equality. They had mixed races, integrated jazz clubs, Jewish financiers, and Negro soldiers. They were not a pure people but a corruption, a biological and spiritual threat disguised as democracy. Women internalized this ideology in specific ways. The Reich taught them that their value lay in racial purity and motherhood. They were the vessels of the Volksfuture, the guardians of German blood. And sexual violence, the contamination of that blood by enemy races, was presented as a fate worse than death. When Goebbels spoke of what would happen if Germany lost, he painted pictures of mass rape and humiliation, of German women subjected to the basest desires of subhuman enemies. The evidence from the Eastern Front seemed to confirm these fears. By January 1945, the Red Army had entered East Prussia, and the stories that came back were horrific. Soviet soldiers, brutalized by years of total war and driven by revenge for German atrocities in Russia, committed widespread sexual violence against German civilians. In towns like Nemmersdorf, the discoveries made when Wehrmacht forces briefly retook the area shocked even hardened veterans. The propaganda ministry exploited these atrocities ruthlessly, using them to paint a picture of what all Allied forces would do. So when Elisabeth Mahler heard those American boots above her cellar, she expected the worst. Not because she was hysterical or irrational, but because everything in her experience suggested that this was how war ended for the losing side. The strong took what they wanted from the weak. The victors claimed the bodies of the vanquished. This was the logic of total war, the lesson of history, the promise of apocalypse that Goebbels had made in his Total War speech of 1943. Private First Class Robert Henderson from Terre Haute, Indiana, was 22 years old when he entered Aachen with the 1st Infantry Division. He had landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day +3, fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, survived the Hurtgen Forest's meat grinder, and now found himself in the first major German city to fall to the Allies. His letters home, preserved now in the National Archives, describe what he found in those cellars. "Mom, you wouldn't believe how scared they were. We'd clear a building and find whole families hiding in basements, sometimes 20 or 30 people crammed into a space smaller than our living room. The women would be crying, holding their kids, some of them just shaking. When we first opened the doors, they'd scream. They thought we were going to kill them, or worse." Sergeant Miller started carrying extra chocolate bars just to hand out to the kids. He said it was the fastest way to show we weren't there to hurt them. At first the mothers wouldn't let the children take it. They thought it might be poisoned or some kind of trick. But after the first few, word spread. "We're not like the Russians, Mom. We're not here for revenge." This wasn't isolated incident or individual virtue. It was policy, codified and enforced from the highest levels of command. General Eisenhower had been explicit. The American Army would conduct itself with discipline and respect toward civilians. Fraternization might be discouraged, but brutality was forbidden. Rape was a court-martial offense, and unlike some armies, the American military actually prosecuted it. Between 1945 and 1948, the U.S. Army executed several soldiers for sexual assault against German women, a fact that sent shockwaves through German communities who had never imagined that an occupying army would hold its own men accountable for crimes against the conquered. But it went beyond mere absence of atrocity. The Americans brought resources on a scale that defied comprehension. When the 104th Infantry Division's Medical Corps set up aid stations in captured German towns, they didn't distinguish between military and civilian casualties. German women who had been wounded in bombing raids, who had been living with shrapnel wounds and untreated infections for weeks or months because Wehrmacht resources went to soldiers first, suddenly found themselves being treated by enemy doctors. Dr. Samuel Weiss, a battalion surgeon from Baltimore, kept detailed journals of this period. His entry from February 3, 1945, describes treating a German woman in Eschweiler. Patient presented with severe malnutrition, infected wounds to left leg and abdomen from bombing debris, and symptoms of exposure. She was terrified when the medics brought her in, wouldn't make eye contact, kept trying to cover herself with torn fabric. Through an interpreter, she told us she thought we would experiment on her. She'd heard stories about what would happen to German civilians in Allied hands. We cleaned and dressed her wounds, gave her sulfa drugs for the infection, and got hot food into her. When we brought blankets, real wool blankets, not the thin recycled stuff the Wehrmacht was using by then, she started crying. She kept asking Warren, why? Why were we helping her? Why weren't we hurting her? I didn't have a good answer except to say that this was what doctors did. We helped people. That seemed to confuse her even more. This confusion was the point. Every warm blanket, every chocolate bar, every instance of medical care freely given challenged the fundamental worldview that the Nazi state had constructed. If the Americans were subhuman mongrels corrupted by Jewish influence, why did they share their abundant resources? If they were spiritually hollow materialists, why did they show restraint and discipline? If democracy was weak and decadent, why had it produced an army that could afford to be merciful? Part of what made the American presence so psychologically disruptive was the sheer material wealth it represented. By early 1945, Germany was starving. Rationing had begun in 1939 and tightened progressively throughout the war. By the final year, civilian rations in many cities provided less than 1,000 calories per day. People survived on turnip soup, ersatz coffee made from acorns, bread bulked out with sawdust. Butter, meat, and real milk were distant memories for most urban Germans. Into this landscape of deprivation came an American army that seemed to be drowning in supplies. A single U.S. infantry division consumed approximately 650 tons of supplies per day. American soldiers ate canned meat, white bread, chocolate, candy, coffee with real cream and sugar. They threw away more food in their mess tents than German civilians saw in a week. They had fresh uniforms, new boots, cigarettes by the carton. Cigarettes became their own form of currency, a symbol of American excess. While German soldiers scraped together handfuls of low-quality tobacco and rolled it in newspaper, American GIs carried packs of Lucky Strikes and Camels, mass-produced and abundant. A single cigarette could buy a meal. A carton could buy safety. Women who had nothing else to trade learned quickly that Americans valued different things than Wehrmacht soldiers had, not sexual favors extracted by force, but laundry service, information, translation help. The transaction was still unequal, still shaped by the power dynamics of occupation, but it was transaction rather than simply taking. This abundance wasn't accidental. It was the product of American industrial capacity operating at a scale that Germany had never been able to match. While German women had been melting down their pots and pans for the war effort since 1940, American factories were producing everything from bombers to K-rations on assembly lines that worked around the clock. The United States entered the war with an economy larger than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined, and never faced strategic bombing or ground warfare on its own territory. The result was an asymmetry of resources so vast that it seemed almost incomprehensible to Germans who had been told that their superior race and ideology would compensate for any material disadvantage. But here was the evidence, undeniable and overwhelming. The mongrel democracy had outproduced the master race. The spiritually hollow materialists had more of everything. The corrupt Jewish-influenced capitalism had proven more efficient than Aryan socialism. Every C-ration, every Jeep, every wool blanket was a small refutation of Nazi ideology. Margaret Schreiber was 19 when the Americans arrived in her hometown of Düren in February 1945. The town had been 99% destroyed by Allied bombing. It held the grim distinction of being one of the most thoroughly demolished cities in Germany. She and her mother lived in what remained of their cellar, with only a tarp stretched over the exposed space where their house had been. 50 years later, interviewed for an oral history project, she remembered the day an American medical unit set up operations in the ruined church near her home. We had heard the stories. We knew what happened in East Prussia, and we had been told that the Americans would be just as bad, or worse because they had Negroes in their army and Negroes were animals. My mother told me that if the Americans came, I should try to kill myself rather than be dishonored. But we were starving. I had dysentery from drinking bad water. My mother had a cough that sounded like death. We decided to risk it. Better to be shot quickly than to die slowly in that cellar. When we came out, the American soldiers just stared at us. I think we must have looked like ghosts. One of them, I remember he had red hair and freckles, started calling for a medic. They brought us to the church. There was a doctor there, a Jewish doctor. I could tell from his name. Here was this Jewish man, whose people we had, and he was helping us. They gave us food. Real soup with meat in it. Clean water. They treated my dysentery and my mother's cough. And when night came, they gave us blankets and let us sleep there in the church, with guards posted outside. Not to keep us in, but to keep us safe. The doctor, Dr. Goldstein, I still remember his name. He came to check on us before he went to sleep. He spoke a little German. He said, "You're safe now. The war is over for you." I didn't believe him at first. I thought it was a trick, that they were being kind so they could hurt us worse later. That's what we had been taught, that the Americans were treacherous, that they smiled while they stabbed you in the back. But days passed, and they kept being kind. Not all of them. Some were hard, some were angry about what they'd seen in the camps. But most of them just treated us like people. Like we were human beings who deserved food and medicine and safety. That was what broke me. Not the bombing, not the defeat, not even learning what had been done in our name in the camps. It was that simple kindness from people who had every right to hate us. That's what made me understand that everything we had been told was a lie. Nazi ideology had always been uncomfortable with American abundance. It didn't fit the narrative. If racial superiority determined historical outcomes, then how could a mongrel nation outproduce and outfight the supposed master race? The solution was to reframe American success as spiritual poverty. Yes, they had materials, but they lacked soul, lacked culture, lacked the spiritual depth that came from blood and soil. This was the line that Goebbels pushed increasingly as the war turned against Germany. That Germans were losing not because they were inferior, but because they were outnumbered by soulless materialism. Quality was being overwhelmed by quantity. Spirit was being crushed by machinery. The implication was that even in defeat, Germans remained spiritually superior to their conquerors. But this ideological framework couldn't withstand direct contact with reality. When German women encountered American soldiers who were both materially abundant and personally decent, who had both overwhelming military power and voluntary restraint in its use, the cognitive dissonance became impossible to ignore. These weren't soulless automatons. They were young men from Iowa and Georgia and California who carried photographs of their own mothers and sisters, who tried to learn German phrases to calm frightened children, who shared their rations with families they had no obligation to feed. The blankets became symbolic of this contradiction. A blanket is such a simple thing, warm wool, practical, unglamorous. But in the context of 1945 Germany, a warm blanket was a luxury beyond price. Germans were cold that winter, colder than they had been in years because coal was reserved for the military, because infrastructure was destroyed, because everything had been sacrificed to total war. American soldiers had blankets to spare. They could afford to give them away to enemy civilians because their supply chain was so robust that individual blankets were functionally infinite. Every time an American soldier draped a blanket over the shoulders of a German woman who had expected to be raped, a small ideological surrender occurred. Not a surrender of military forces, but a surrender of worldview. The recipient had to grapple with the fact that the enemy she had been taught to fear and despise was capable of casual generosity that her own government had never shown her. Of all the American military units that entered Germany in 1945, perhaps none had a more profound psychological impact than the Medical Corps. Army doctors and medics were the face of American power at its most contradictory. They had the capacity to kill, but chose instead to heal. They entered German towns and treated everyone: wounded soldiers, civilian casualties, sick children, pregnant women. They didn't ask about political affiliation. They didn't demand proof of anti-Nazi credentials. They just did medicine. This was radical in a context where German military medicine had been thoroughly corrupted by ideology. Wehrmacht doctors had participated in euthanasia programs, had experimented on prisoners, had operated under a system where medical care was rationed based on racial and political criteria. The concept of treating enemy civilians not just adequately but well, using valuable resources on people who could provide no military advantage, was foreign to the German medical establishment. Captain Elizabeth Morrison, an army nurse from Ohio, wrote in her diary about the response she encountered. "The German women don't understand why we help them. They keep asking if we're going to send them a bill, or if they'll have to work it off somehow. The idea that we just treat them because they're injured and we're medics, it doesn't compute." One woman asked me through the interpreter if Americans were Christians. I said, "Yes, most of us." She said, "But we are your enemies. We are guilty of terrible things. Why do you show us mercy?" I told her that guilt and innocence were for the courts to decide. We were just here to keep people from dying if we could prevent it. She cried for an hour after that. The medical response also served a practical purpose, preventing disease outbreaks that could affect occupation forces. But the way it was implemented went far beyond practical necessity. American field hospitals treated German patients with the same standards they used for American soldiers. They didn't have separate inferior facilities for enemy civilians. They didn't provide substandard care. A German woman with an infection received the same sulfa drugs and the same quality of nursing as an American corporal would have received. This wasn't unique to medical care. The American occupation authorities, even in the early months of 1945, were already planning for what would come after the fighting stopped. They brought food aid, engineers to restore water systems, supplies to rebuild infrastructure. The goal wasn't just military victory, but the reconstruction of a functioning society that wouldn't breed another war. Ursula Hoffmann was 7 years old when American forces occupied her town in Baden-Württemberg. In interviews conducted in the 1990s, she recalled details with crystalline clarity. "My clearest memory is of chocolate. I had heard the word, but I had never tasted it. Maybe when I was very small, before the war, but I didn't remember. The first American soldiers who came to our house, we were hiding, of course, my mother and I. One of them had a kind face. He called out in bad German that we should come out, that it was safe. My mother didn't believe him, but I was curious. I peeked around the corner, and he saw me. He smiled and reached into his pocket. My mother grabbed me, pulled me back, certain he was reaching for a gun. But he pulled out a brown paper wrapper and held it out to me. Chocolate. Real chocolate. I looked at my mother. She was frozen, torn between fear and hunger and something else, maybe hope. The soldier unwrapped it himself and took a bite to show it wasn't poison. Then he held it out again. I took it. It was the most wonderful thing I had ever tasted. That soldier probably doesn't remember. It was just a chocolate bar to him. But for me, it was the moment I learned that everything I had been taught about the Americans was wrong. If they were truly evil, truly the monsters we had been told about, they wouldn't have chocolate to give to German children. Evil doesn't share. Evil takes. Children, in many ways, adapted faster than adults. They hadn't been as thoroughly indoctrinated, hadn't internalized the racial ideology as deeply. They could accept an American soldier's kindness at face value without the cognitive dissonance that paralyzed their mothers. And in accepting that kindness, they began the process of psychological reconstruction that would define the next generation of Germans. The American soldiers understood this intuitively. Many of them had children at home. They carried photographs of their own kids and saw reflections of them in the dirty, hungry German children who appeared in every town. This wasn't strategic thinking. It was basic human empathy. But it had strategic consequences. Those children who received chocolate and kindness in 1945 grew up to be adults in the 1950s and 1960s, adults who remembered that Americans had been human to them when they had no obligation to be. No discussion of German women's experience with American forces can ignore the stark contrast with what was happening simultaneously in the Soviet occupation zone. The Red Army's conduct in Germany was shaped by different factors: the brutal war the Soviets had endured, the atrocities committed by German forces in Russia, Stalin's tacit tolerance of looting and sexual violence as a form of reward for his soldiers. The numbers are difficult to establish with certainty, but historians estimate that Soviet soldiers raped somewhere between several 100,000–2 million German women between 1945 and 1949. The violence was systematic and widespread. In some areas, virtually every woman between the ages of 12 and 60 was assaulted multiple times. The psychological and physical devastation was immense. German women who encountered both Soviet and American forces, usually those who fled westward as the Red Army advanced, described the difference in visceral terms. Maria Braun, who escaped from East Prussia in February 1945 and eventually reached the American zone in Bavaria, gave testimony in 1947. The Russians took everything. They took our food, our possessions, our dignity, our bodies. There was no mercy, no humanity. They saw us as things, as objects of revenge for what had been done in Russia. I cannot say they had no right to their anger. We knew what our army had done there. But the cruelty was absolute. When I finally reached the American zone, I was half dead. Starving, wounded, traumatized. I expected nothing different from the Americans except perhaps a quicker death. But they fed me. They gave me medical care. They treated me like a human being. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for them to reveal that this kindness was a prelude to something worse. But it never came. They were just decent. Professionally, almost mechanically decent, but decent nonetheless. I asked one of the American officers why they were different from the Russians. He said something I've never forgotten: "We're not here for revenge. We're here to win the peace." At the time, I didn't understand what that meant. But over time, I came to see it. The Americans weren't just defeating Germany. They were trying to build something new from the ruins. They couldn't do that through cruelty. This contrast had profound political implications. Germans who experienced Soviet occupation developed a visceral anti-communism that would define West German politics for generations. But Germans who experienced American occupation developed something more complex: a grudging respect, a recognition that their conquerors had chosen restraint when they could have chosen revenge, and that choice meant something. By the summer of 1945, as Germany signed its unconditional surrender and the full horror of the concentration camps became undeniable public knowledge, German women faced a double psychological crisis. First, they had to reconcile what had been done in their nation's name: the industrial murder of millions, the systematic brutality that had no precedent in human history. Second, they had to reconcile the fact that the subhuman mongrels they had been taught to despise had shown them more humanity than their own government ever had. This created what psychologists would later call cognitive dissonance on a societal scale. The Nazi worldview required that Germans be superior and their enemies be inferior. But the evidence of 1945 proved the opposite. German moral superiority was a fiction drenched in blood, while American material and moral resources were overwhelming and undeniable. Some Germans retreated into denial, clinging to fragments of the old ideology or claiming they had never really believed in Hitler. But many others, especially women who had direct contact with American forces, underwent genuine transformations of understanding. They had expected monsters and encountered men. They had begged for mercy and received not just their lives but medical care, food, blankets, and eventually a program of reconstruction that would rebuild their shattered nation into an economic powerhouse within a generation. Hildegard Schmidt, a mother of 3 who survived the bombing of Hamburg and the subsequent occupation, wrote in her private diary in August 1945, "I feel as though I have awakened from a 12-year nightmare into a reality I do not recognize. Everything I believed has proven false. We were not the master race. We were the slaves of a mad ideology. We were not destined to rule. We were destined to destroy ourselves. And the people we were taught to hate and fear have saved us from the consequences of our own evil. When the American doctor gave my son medicine for his fever, I felt shame so profound I could barely breathe." This Jewish man from New York was saving the life of a German child whose country had tried to exterminate his people. He had every right to let my son die. Instead, he worked through the night to bring down the fever. In the morning, when my son opened his eyes and smiled, the doctor smiled back and ruffled his hair. He said, "He's a tough kid. He'll be fine." How do I live with this? How do I integrate what I now know with what I believed for so long? I cannot. The person I was is dead. I must become someone new, someone who understands that power without morality is meaningless, that abundance without compassion is poverty, that the measure of a civilization is not how it treats its strongest members but how it treats its weakest enemies. The experiences of those early months of occupation cast a long shadow over German-American relations. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, brought billions of dollars in aid to rebuild Western Europe, including West Germany. The Berlin airlift of 1948 to 1949, when American and British planes flew supplies into West Berlin for nearly a year to break the Soviet blockade, demonstrated American commitment to German freedom in dramatic terms. But the psychological foundation for accepting that aid, for choosing the Western path over Soviet communism, was laid in those cellars in 1945 when terrified women received blankets instead of brutality. The Marshall Plan worked in West Germany partly because Germans had already learned that American abundance came with unexpected restraint, that democratic capitalism could afford to be generous because its productive capacity was so vast. The generation of women who experienced the occupation firsthand passed their memories to their children and grandchildren. They told stories about American soldiers who had been kind when they could have been cruel, who had shared chocolate with enemy children, who had treated German civilians with a basic decency that their own government had denied to others. These stories became part of the founding mythology of the Federal Republic of Germany. The idea that democracy and market economics and alignment with the West were not just politically expedient but morally superior to the alternative. This doesn't mean the occupation was uniformly benevolent. There were incidents of American soldiers committing crimes against German civilians. There were problems with fraternization, with black market activity, with the inevitable friction of military occupation. The trials at Nuremberg and the denazification program were sometimes arbitrary and often failed to hold the truly guilty accountable while punishing minor offenders. But the overall pattern was clear and undeniable. The American occupation of Germany was qualitatively different from what Germans had expected and from what was happening in the Soviet zone. That difference mattered. It created space for reconciliation, for rebuilding, for the emergence of a stable democracy from the ruins of totalitarianism. Of all the material objects that American forces brought to Germany, the blanket became the most potent symbol. Not the tank, though American armor was superior. Not the bomber, though American air power was overwhelming. Not even the chocolate, though that had its own symbolic weight. The blanket, simple, practical, unglamorous, represented something that transcended military victory. A blanket is an act of care. It provides warmth when someone is cold, comfort when someone is vulnerable, protection when someone is exposed. You cannot use a blanket to assert dominance or extract submission. Its only purpose is to make someone more comfortable, to meet a basic human need. When American soldiers gave blankets to German women who had expected to be raped, they were performing an act of radical humanity. They were saying, without words, that the woman's comfort mattered more than revenge, that her physical well-being was worth the cost of a piece of wool that the American supply chain could easily replace. They were treating a member of an enemy nation, a nation that had perpetrated unspeakable atrocities, as a human being worthy of basic care. This act challenged everything the Nazi ideology had taught about power and race. In the Nazi framework, power existed to dominate and extract. The strong took what they wanted from the weak because that was natural order. Mercy was weakness, compassion was decadence, and showing kindness to enemies was racial suicide. But here was a more powerful military force choosing restraint. Here were conquerors who brought blankets instead of brutality. Here was abundance that could afford to be generous. The lesson was clear. The democratic, multicultural, capitalist United States had developed a form of power that was both materially and morally superior to Nazi racial ideology. They could afford to be merciful because their system produced such overwhelming resources. They chose to be merciful because their values, however imperfectly practiced, included the idea that all humans had inherent dignity. By the time the last American occupation forces left Germany in 1994, more than 4 decades had passed since those winter days of 1945. The Germany they left behind was unrecognizable from the Germany they had entered, prosperous, democratic, peaceful, fully integrated into Western institutions. The women who had cowered in cellars expecting the worst had become grandmothers in a nation that was one of America's closest allies. The blankets were long gone, worn out or discarded or faded into memory. But what they represented endured. They represented the moment when one worldview collapsed and another became possible. When racial superiority met material abundance and moral restraint and discovered it had no answer. When ideology confronted reality and reality won. There is a photograph, taken by an Army Signal Corps photographer in March 1945, that captures this moment. It shows a young German woman, maybe 25 years old, sitting on rubble in what had once been a street in Cologne. An American medic has just wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. She is looking up at him with an expression that defies easy description: confusion, relief, disbelief, gratitude, shame, all mixed together. The medic is looking down at her with professional concern, checking to see if she needs further medical attention. Neither of them is smiling. This is not a happy moment. But it is a human one. The caption on the photograph, written by the Signal Corps officer, reads simply, "Medical aid to civilian, Cologne, Germany." But historians who study this period see something more in that image. They see the collision of two Americas, the America that had to fight its way across Europe at terrible cost, and the America that chose to rebuild rather than punish. They see the beginning of reconciliation, the first tentative step toward healing wounds that had seemed too deep to ever close. And they see a woman learning, in real time, that everything she had been taught was a lie. The blankets were not free. They were paid for by American taxpayers, shipped across an ocean at great expense, distributed by an army that had already given so much. But in the economy of history, in the mathematics of reconciliation and rebuilding, they were perhaps the best investment the United States ever made. Because those blankets said something that no speech or treaty or military victory could say, that the American idea, for all its flaws and contradictions and failures, included within it the possibility of mercy toward enemies, the capacity for generosity in victory, the willingness to see humanity even in those who had aligned themselves with evil. German women begged for mercy in the winter of 1945. American soldiers offered warm blankets instead. And in that exchange, a different future became possible. Not guaranteed, not inevitable, but possible. The women who received those blankets became the mothers and grandmothers of a democratic Germany. They told their children and grandchildren about what they had expected and what they had received. They passed down a memory that shaped how Germany understood itself and its place in the world. This is not a story of American perfection. The United States was and remains a flawed nation, struggling with its own racism and inequality and historical crimes. But in that moment, in those ruined German cities, American forces demonstrated that abundance and restraint could coexist, that power could be tempered by mercy, that democracy, for all its messy inefficiency, produced a form of civilization capable of genuine generosity toward defeated enemies. The blankets are gone. The women who received them are mostly gone too, faded into history like the Reich they once served. But the lesson remains, carved into the architecture of modern Germany, embedded in the foundation of the post-war order, that the measure of a civilization is not just how it fights, but how it wins. Not just how it treats its own people, but how it treats its enemies. Not just what it takes, but what it gives. In the end, the Americans who entered Germany in 1945 brought something more powerful than tanks or bombs or tactical supremacy. They brought blankets and medicine and chocolate and the quiet radical assertion that even in total victory, even toward an enemy that had committed unforgivable crimes, humanity was still possible. That restraint was not weakness but strength. That mercy was not sentiment but strategy. And the women who begged for mercy and received instead a warm blanket, they learned, one by one, in cellars and aid stations across the ruins of the Reich, that the future belonged not to the ideology of domination but to the practice of decency. Not to the myth of racial superiority but to the reality of material abundance tempered by moral choice. The blankets told a truth that no propaganda could refute, that democracy, for all its flaws, had created something the master race could never match. Not just more tanks or better logistics, but a civilization capable of offering warmth to those who had sought its destruction, mercy to those who had shown none, and hope to those who had none left. That was the real victory of 1945. Not the military defeat of the Wehrmacht, but the moral defeat of the ideology that had animated it. And it was one blanket at a time, in 1,000 cellars across the Rhineland, by young American soldiers who chose to be human when they could have chosen to be conquerors. The women who begged for mercy received something better. They received proof that another way was possible. And in receiving that proof, they became the foundation on which a different Germany could be built, one where the old lies had no power, because reality had proven them false beyond any doubt. In the end, that may be the most devastating form of victory. Not to destroy your enemy, but to prove their worldview wrong so completely that even they cannot deny it. The blankets did that. They were soft, warm, practical symbols of a harder truth, that the American way, for all its compromises and contradictions, had created something the Reich never could, power that could afford to be merciful, abundance that could afford to be generous, and victory that could afford to be human. That was what those women learned in the winter of 1945. That was what they carried forward into the peace. That was the lesson written in wool and chocolate and clean bandages, a lesson that would echo through generations, shaping the contours of the post-war world in ways that no treaty or occupation policy ever could. The blankets were just blankets. But in that moment, in that place, they were everything.